The Cape is usually a place where I come from refuge from this kind of work, rather than talking about it. But I'm really thrilled to be here tonight. I'm thrilled to be here during Pride Week, which feels really significant. And I'm particularly thrilled to be here with you, Andrew, because I'm a huge, longtime admirer of your work. And I've read your work and talked back to it and engaged with it for so long that I'm really, really happy to be here. And I'm also, I should say, I'm staggered to be here because it was really only a year ago that we started investigating Weinstein. It was a year ago, April. And so, last summer I was actually on the Cape with my friend Luke, who's somewhere here. We were keeping my computer in his gun safe in his house because we were worried about Weinstein's antics and worried about keeping, all of my technology secure. And so it sorry? You mean wine safe. And and so. Yeah, so anyway, it feels absolutely miraculous to me to come back here and to know that, not only did we get the story we were trying to get, but all of these staggering things have happened since.
What was the reaction within the New York Times to the story, and why do you think it took the New York Times to break this? As opposed to, well, I guess Ronan Farrow was also on the trail. We were
using different tools than Farrow and different tools than journalists had in the past. And I think the reason we were able to do it is that we're investigative reporters. I work in the investigative unit at the Times, and many people you and I know had tried to get the Weinstein story for a long time. And I think they were using mainly the tools of magazine journalism, and they were trying to get on the record interviews with the actresses, which we eventually did. But the way we got those interviews was by building a body of evidence. We realized very early on, actresses were honest with us in private in the initial stages of the reporting, but many of them said, I can never tell this story publicly, or I'm very reluctant to. So what Megan and I spent all of those months doing was looking for evidence. And if you look at the first story we published, it has all of these documents. It has internal Weinstein Company memos. It has 30 years of allegations. It has a lot about the cover-up of the allegations. And so before we were ready to publish, we were able to go, for example, to Ashley Judd and say, we're not asking you to go out on a diving board and to go into a pure he said, she said situation where you're going to tell one story and Weinstein's going to tell another, and then it's just going to be this tennis match, right, of who's telling the truth. We're saying we've built you a strong platform of evidence showing that at that point it was 30 years, now it's 40 years worth of allegations, but over a 30-year period, women who don't know each other, actresses, assistants, former employees, British, American, they're all telling variations on the same story about Harvey Weinstein. And the story is about that and about the fact that nobody ever tried to stop this.
Would you have run it if none of them wanted to speak on the record?
Yes, because we had the documents and we had the proof. So, I think, and also, by the way, the moral gravity of the investigation shifted at a certain point, because when I first started working on that story, I thought the allegations were from the 90s. And I said to myself, we're correcting the historical record. We've discovered something here that is rotten about our pop culture, and it's important to set the record straight, to show that behind Pulp Fiction and behind all of these Academy Awards, et cetera, something much darker was happening. And then as we went along in our reporting, we found that essentially this behavior never stopped. And we had these we had these instances from 2014 and 2015, and so the stakes became much higher, and the stakes became higher to publish because there was this sense of having to stop a predator who had very recently been active, we thought.
Right. It was more like a police investigation. Is that what you're saying? Wow. All these things were in the public record, or did you actually have spies?
No, there was nothing, almost nothing. The only thing in the public record was a kind of fumbled NYPD investigation from 2015, where there was this Italian model, Ambra Battagliana, who had brought allegations against Weinstein, and it turns out that Weinstein had used his whole arsenal to kind of brush her to the side. And she took a private settlement. She took money, essentially, and agreed never to speak about it again. So
how many months did it take you to burrow down and find all this documentation?
6 months to break the initial story, but then we kept investigating. I mean, because the story kept getting bigger and bigger, and we found that once we published, the next question we really wanted to focus on was why so many people had helped him. The moral horror of the Weinstein story is that this guy could rack up 40 years of allegations, and instead of anybody stopping him, a few people tried along the way, they didn't succeed, more and more people helped him. So why is that, and who were those people? And we felt like that was part of the accountability project.
What do you think their answer would be? Why did you enable, empower, cover up for this behavior?
I think they would say things like, oh, I didn't know the extent of it. You know, people made 2 category errors with Weinstein. They said, the boss is fooling around and that's none of my business. He's having an extramarital affair. It's really embarrassing for me to talk about it. Like, I don't want to know. And I mean,
and they maybe didn't know.
Some of them knew that they knew that there were problems, but you know, maybe some people knew more specifics. The people who knew range from lawyers, employers of the Weinstein Company, who actively settled women for assault allegations. So
they obviously knew.
They knew that their colleagues had assault allegations. To people who you know heard about like women problems but didn't inquire further. So people made the mistake of saying, oh, the boss is sleeping with some girl. I don't want to go anywhere near that. That's weird. He's married. I'm embarrassed. He's the boss. And then the other mistake that people made again and again is they said, I'll be frank, they said actresses are sluts. They said this is what these people.
That's Weinstein's lawyers.
No, not
defense,
just his
right?
lawyers. People in Hollywood said it to us as recently as last summer. They said, oh, Jodi, that's like they're actresses. That's what they do. It's what they do for parts. And then you would actually talk to the actress and she would say things like, I was terrified. You know, I didn't know it was going to happen. I didn't have a good choice to make. If I had said yes, that was problematic. If I said no, there were going to be consequences. And so people.
They thought they would lose their jobs and have their careers peter out because
yes,
he would.
That's what the actresses
thought. They believed he would do that to them.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I there's something in particular I wanted to ask you that I've had on my mind, you know, for months and months.
Oh Lord.
Reporting is unfolded, which is. I have thought a lot about Me Too as a social movement, and that's hard to think about because it's very new and it's very disparate, and it doesn't have some of the traditional elements of organization and discipline and clear leadership that some social movements do. But what I think it does have in common with some social movements, and the one that's central to your history, is that it has the idea of common decency at its center, right? That a woman should not go into a workplace and be pressured sexually. She should be there and she should be treated as a professional. So I would love to hear you kind of evaluate Me Too as a social movement. Do you think it's built to last? What are the elements of successful social movements? And what do you see as its positives and its negatives, and what was the timeline from when you wrote the New Republic article to when gay marriage was passed at the federal level?
26 years.
Right. If Me Too were to have a quarter century strategy and be a quarter century quest, what do you think that would look like?
Well, this is partly one of the issues with it. Is what is the movement then? What is it actually about? And And that's a big question. And the way it has, insofar as, let's put it this way, insofar as, and I want to say this very clearly, as far as this is exposed, and your model of journalism in this respect, getting someone that big, that well, and definitively, is a really hard thing to do. You have standards, and if they weren't going to hold up, you weren't going to run this story. And I think that's been a huge success already. I just think that people are, men especially in power, are particularly aware now of this. It has moved into public consciousness. In that sense, the movement kind of had its moment. And men in the workplace, or women, a few women in the workplace, no, they can't harass or abuse. Now, we may forget about this, but there's no way you can legally, what would be the goal to get? I mean, our goal was to get legal civil marriage, which is this clear goal. How you do it is another question. But what would be the ultimate goal of Me Too? I don't know. I think that some of the people that have glommed onto it have a much bigger agenda than just sexual harassment in the workplace. You saw immediately how it jumped to sexual harassment by Aziz Ansari. And that story itself, the fact that it ran and the fact that plenty of people defended it, struck me as a step beyond what the movement had originally set out to do. I think it also got caught up in, and this has to be, so I had only two specific quibbles with Me Too. The first was, I don't like people publishing 70 named people, putting it on the internet and saying, we don't know if these people are rapists or whatever, but here's the list. You know if he's working for you. So it was a way, it was. I don't think anybody, I don't like lists of people to be gotten unless there's clear evidence. And the other beef was that there was no distinction made between a clumsy, dumb text message and assault, battery, and rape. They were all put together, which tells you something about the motives of the people who set up that particular list.
I don't know if it tells you something about the motives. I think it tells you something about, I think you're onto something important, but I don't know if it's motive. So the thing I agree with you about is that the goals of Me Too are not, people have different ideas about them. Tarana Burke, who's the person who coined that phrase, what she says is that it's about victims and it's about survivors and it's about making them whole and them being free of shame and about the onus being on the abusers and not the abused, and them getting whatever they need, whether it's therapy or criminal accountability or whatever, to move on with their lives. I think other people would say that Me Too is about dismantling the patriarchy. They see harassment as a solvent for much bigger gender issues, which in some ways it is. And then other people, I think, would say, you know, this is about women in the workplace, right? And we've now realized that harassment and worse is a terrible drain on the quest for equality in the workplace. And you can't really solve the harassment issue until you've got men and women equally in power. So there's maybe a confusion, but I think also kind of a richness to those different goals. And I think it's going to take a while to sort them out. What I do think the movement has is incredible durability. I don't agree with you with what you said about how something had its moment, because to me this just goes on and on and on. I think we're in week 34 or something of
it seems to have petered out a little bit lately, in the press anyway.
I don't think it does, because every time it does, a Larry Nassar case or an Eric Schneiderman case comes along, or Donald Trump and the NDAs comes up. And so, and we also see it on a local news level. I was in Western Massachusetts last weekend, and the front page of the Hampshire Daily Gazette had a story about a local judge who had gotten in trouble for doing something very inappropriate in his chambers. And part of what's interesting to me is that I think I think it's actually very self-correcting, because when the two kind of negative examples you named, I think it was called the Shitty Men in Media list, and the Aziz Ansari allegations. Those are obviously things that don't meet the standard of the New York Times, right? They're kind of the opposite of what we do in many.
But they tell you again a little bit about where the people in this movement are coming from.
But I think what was interesting is that so many women who feel really strongly about Me Too critiqued those things. And with the Ansari thing in particular, I remember when that came out, I got worried, because having worked so much on harassment and serious issues, I thought to myself, God, is this all going to go into this gray zone of like what happens in the private realm? And I think, by the way, there's a very interesting conversation to be had about, romantic relationships and power dynamics, but it's not the same accountability conversation that we've been having with these abuses. And so I remember feeling nervous that was the direction the discussion was taking. And then the next week, the Larry Nassar case exploded. And we were back to the Weinstein questions of how could this have happened? What were the institutions? Who protected the women and who protected this abuser? How could one man have caused such incredible damage to so many women? What is it about these gymnasts who are sort of analogous to the actresses, right? How are they symbolic of our ideas about femininity and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I have felt throughout that even though this is a very painful conversation, there's something about it that keeps returning to center that seems very healthy.
Yeah, I agree. Insofar as it does hold those people to account, I'm 1,000% in favor of it. And I'm also 1,000% in favor of the fact that it has a definitely chilling and mind-altering effect on employment and offices and that notion of I'm a little bummed out by the fact that it has made inter-office romantic relationships incredibly hard. You're just terrified at any moment. I also don't believe that that sexual abuse of women defines men, where there is a considerable amount of opinion, feminist opinion, which is that it does. If you should treat every man as a potential rapist because they're men. This is the argument you hear. Guilty before innocent. Just as it was, we'll name all these people and then we'll wait to find the evidence for it. But the woman who did this, Maura Donegan, said in defense, well, if they're innocent, fine. What harm have we done? And your paper lionized this person.
Well, it's funny you mention the paper, because I feel like through my reporting, I'm sort of spending time with different people than you are. And in my reporting, so I've done a fair amount of reporting on what's going on in offices. And I think you're right that there is just mass confusion out there. But I think it's because we have so much new information at once. It turns out that we did not really understand what was happening with women in the workplace. And even people like me, who have written about gender for years and years, I pride myself on understanding this stuff. I didn't know the half of it. Almost nobody did. And so all of a sudden, we've got these massive revelations, right? And we've got more information than we've ever had before on what women have really faced in the workplace. And we're able to see patterns we've never seen before, like even certain patterns of physical behavior that come up in these stories again and again. Everybody's saying, I didn't even know that was like a stream of behavior, right? But now that we've seen them in 20 stories, we realize that it is.
And also, people who are in the future subject to this kind of behavior will recognize it exactly for what it is, exactly. and call it out,
right? Like
preferably, and be immune from losing their career path as a function of it, which I think is the key thing. I mean, the HR departments exist to stop this kind of thing, these conflicts, but HR departments are also cultural places, and they also don't want to disrupt the companies they're a part of. But when people don't feel empowered to report it because they fear that the company itself will not back them up, then it goes under the cover. So if this actually has changed that dynamic, that you can now go to HR, you can tell HR, this is what's happening. It mirrors these other cases I've seen in the public. We all know this is, no one believes this is good. No one, except the president. And I want to ask you.
But I want to go back to the confusion in the offices, because I can tell you about that from my reporting. So I
episode where they came across the PC principal and a strong woman. These two characters, they were dating, and they worked together in this high school. And when they were discovered actually canoodling in a tent somewhere, everybody found them, saw that they were having a relationship, and upon immediately hearing that, they puked. In the office, it was literally a visceral puke at the thought of anybody in any office having any kind of sexual or romantic. So I know you don't want that to happen. And I know you don't want it to happen that men feel incredibly constrained. One of the dynamics here is obviously sex and gender. We know it can go both ways. In other words, that women in power can also do this. It seems less likely, less often, much less often, I say. Power corrupts, so we know that happens. But where was I? I'm sorry.
No, I want to tell you about the confusion you're talking about in offices, because here's how it comes. Here's what I think is going on in the workplace, and I'll be curious to see if this rings true to your own descriptions. We now have all this new information, right, that we never had, of these patterns of behavior. And so people are figuring out what to do about it. And the severe cases in some ways are the easiest. If somebody has assaulted multiple women in the workplace, that's a no-brainer. That person deserves to be fired, their career may be over, et cetera, et cetera. The cases that are confusing are the mild to medium offenses. And I think basically we're just in this moment of not really knowing what to do about those, because we never had enough information. For the first time, we have better facts, and the reason it's so confusing is that it's actually quite nuanced. For example, we have found in our reporting that women will say, okay, so workplaces in the last couple of months have sometimes found it convenient or appealing to say, we have zero tolerance policies. But the problem is that a lot of women don't actually like zero tolerance policies because they don't necessarily want to see somebody fired for doing something relatively mild or minor. They may say, I don't want to be the executioner of this person's career. I may like this person or value them in some professional capacity. I just need this behavior to stop. And I think to questions like, well, if it's not firing, what are the sanctions? Is there a way to, address this in the workplace short of firing? What is like the sort of education system that works, because sexual harassment trainings are mostly terrible and ineffective. And also, you can't totally let go of the mild to medium incidents. You can't say we're not going to count those, because they're also the best way of preventing more severe incidents. And there were a lot of harassers who started out doing relatively minor things, and then the behavior got worse and worse. So for me, I think I see it in less like ideologically or polarized terms than you do. I see a lot of really confused, well-meaning people trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, the structural problem comes with the fact that the nature of men and women, that mainly men take the initiative sexually. There's a convention that's the case, but there's also, given testosterone, given the way men are, they can come all the time. They're ready for reproduction at every minute. Women are only ready for reproduction as such once a month. There are periods when they're fertile. I think that always means that most men actually make the first move. Now, making the first move with someone is always a tricky thing. You don't want to look a fool. You don't want to be humiliated publicly. You don't want her to think you're some kind of creepy person. But you make an effort. And say you make an effort that's lame, that's horribly counterproductive, that she doesn't like. And then, lo and behold, they find that that guy is treating that woman not so well in the office, maybe freezing her out. That's a mild example of something that happens. You wouldn't think that would be subject to the law.
Well, part of the problem is that the law protects women so little. The sexual harassment laws are so weak. A lot of the allegations you see with Weinstein, you would not have been able to win a sexual harassment case on because, for example, if you look at the federal sexual harassment statutes, freelancers aren't covered, and also job applicants or people you might potentially employ are not covered. So if you're an actress and you're, possibly up for a part in a Weinstein movie and he harasses you, you can't actually sue him for harassment. They're trying to change that in places like the state of California. But I think the scenario you're describing, which is essentially like a romantic overture gone bad, I think the current feeling now is that there needs, I think what I was going to say is I think the current feeling is now that there need to be better boundaries, because what you hear women say.
Tell me where the boundary should lie.
I'm a reporter, so I feel like my job is to observe.
These are often subjective experiences.
I can tell you less. It's less my opinion than what I hear women saying. What I hear women saying is that they'd like to know what kind of ground they stand on, and that there's a uniquely terrible feeling of having, say, a male boss invite you out for a drink because you think he's interested in your ideas and your professional potential and your hard work. And instead, there's some, God, you look really hot in that dress. Can we go up to my hotel room? And what we hear women say is that they want to know what kind of interaction they're in, that if somebody's going to ask them out on a date in a workplace, the person should say, hey, I know we have a professional relationship, but can we change this up and move to a date? What you don't want is your boss hitting on you. And by the way, we come from a world, I'm sure everybody here knows people like this, we come from a world in which it's completely normal for CEOs to marry their secretaries, and some of those are happy marriages, right? And so this is all very nuanced and somewhat confusing.
Let me raise another question, which is obviously in some of these cases there are legal consequences of Weinstein. Most of them don't actually have legal consequences. They're not criminally prosecuted, but their careers and lives are over for good. Does that not seem, of all the sins one can commit in private life, is that in such a terrible level that it enforces ostricism forever?
I don't think we know yet. I think it's too early because...
They're not treating them like...
No,
people used to treat adulterers by actually naming them, shaming them, and ostracizing them.
I think what we don't know yet, what we collectively don't know, not just as investigative reporters at the New York Times, is whether it's possible for a man who's committed serious offenses to come back in a way that's genuine and satisfying to people. We don't know what repentance looks like. We know that nobody wants the fake apology tour, right? Nobody wants one of these guys to cry on TV and hire a fancy PR firm to, gradually reintegrate him in some insincere, opportunistic way. But what would it mean? I think I would ask the room this as much as ourselves. If we saw one of these men who's fallen in recent months, what would it take for you to forgive him? What would you want to see for him? What would the work of, if he really has...
You can see this has become an indelible stain for people. And not only that, they've been purged forever. Garrison Keillor, who I haven't seen any actual evidence of what he did wrong, not only has he fired forever from NPR, they actually went in and removed all the archives of this guy, as if he never existed.
You know, it's interesting.
This all has and is backed up by what I think is a very American phenomenon. It's a religious phenomenon. Instead of the Great Awakening, we're having the Great Awakening. And people are suddenly possessed, like they are when they're born again, with the sudden understanding of the world that's different from everybody than they felt before. And it's their commitment to this religion as a way of life that sustains them, gives them meaning. This is the first religion without God.
See, I don't...
But when you think of the way they also treat sinners, they're absolutely unmerciful. There's no mercy in this at all. Let me finish.
Yeah.
And then also with people who disagree with some of the premises, they're heretics and have to be stigmatized and fired from their jobs. In fact, the main object of Twitter seems to be making people lose their jobs rather than disagreeing with them. So I think that's the danger. The danger of any religious fervor is that it sweeps up the innocent with the guilty. It tends to operate in very broad brushes. And it has no real patience for due process.
But, well, as with many things in life, there's a question about whether the Twitter conversation is the real conversation, right? Is what's happening on Twitter, is what's happening on Twitter reality, and our private conversations, which are much more nuanced with our own friends and professional associates, do those like not count? Or are the private conversations and the real work conversations the real ones, and Twitter is just this sort of poor, polarized, snapshot for what's really going on in our society? I can't answer that, but what I do think is happening is that men are experiencing things that women have experienced for a really long time. Questions like, I'm so uncomfortable in this room and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to navigate this vaguely sexual situation. That is something that we have felt forever. The feeling of like, oh God, there's a trap door in this professional workplace, and if I do the wrong thing, I'm gonna fall through it. That is something that women have felt for a really long time.
All women?
I don't think we can ever say all anybody. And then especially the feeling of, holy shit, I'm doing the wrong thing and I have to somehow change my behavior to accommodate the culture, what's now the dominant culture. That's, or not, I don't know if I agree with you about the religion thing, because I think in real life people are much more nuanced about these things. Those are all sort of classic women in the workplace feelings, and now men are experiencing a very sudden rush of versions of all these things.
So it's payback is...
No, I don't think it's payback. I think it's...
That's the logic of what you just said.
But I don't think it's payback, because I don't know any women who are saying, I want the male species to be the victim of what's going on now. And again, like I think I experience...
You don't hear that all over the place?
The dominant thing I hear is men and women saying, we've got to figure this out. We have to do a much better job. We need to rethink, everything from the HR departments to how do we make women feel comfortable coming forward to what men and women can and can't do in the workplace. And also, I should say, I hear a lot of men who are very sensitive to these issues, who are maybe re-examining their own histories. I've heard of men writing letters to people from 20 years ago saying, I'm now looking at this interaction with new eyes and I fear I may have made you very uncomfortable. And I also hear...
Which is great.
Right, which is really interesting. And I hear... And I hear lots of women who don't take like what you're characterizing as the pure feminist line. My overwhelming experience is of a society that's been flooded with new information and is trying to figure out what to do with it.
Yes, but it has fit in, like take campus. Doctrines of what sexual abuse or sexual assault are very vague. Title IX is, on most colleges, means every man is guilty before proven innocent. And we know the standards of proof there are much less stringent than they would be in a criminal operation. So I think it has affected lots of people. The theory that men are, you should assume guilt, and if they prove themselves innocent, fine.
See, the question I hear about campus sexual assault is that I've heard people ask, and I think this is a very smart question. I've heard people say, people who care about the Me Too stuff intensely, saying, I don't want the Me Too debate to go the way of the campus sexual assault debate, which seems polarized and stuck and has left people at odds with no good solution.
But that's the context in which this has arisen. And I think that's important to understand.
See, I don't think so, because I think that the Me Too debate arose with such clear, irrevocable allegations in most cases.
But let's talk about the Aziz Ansari piece. This was a piece written by someone who had essentially a bad date with Aziz Ansari and wrote it up as if it were the equivalent of a rape. And felt justified in publishing such a thing. Doesn't that make you worried that this stuff can be abused? That you can actually use this to falsely accuse people? Or get back at people, or play office politics with people?
I think that I would have been more worried if we had seen that create a wave of other similar pieces. Like if we were sitting here right now, and we've now read about 30 more public figures or celebrities who were on dates that went wrong, and like publishing those accounts had become a thing, right? And more credible publications with high journalistic standards were doing it, and everybody decided that we needed not, like, I'm all for, a re-examination of romantic standards, but one that, as you say, invades people's privacy and deals with incidents that are more ambiguous. I would be more worried.
Do you think that Aziz Ansari, on the basis of that piece, assaulted that woman?
Oh, I mean, I would never. The first thing you learn as a reporter is when you have not reported on particular allegations yourself, you should never.
But you don't. But you don't think just running a first-person piece, making these claims, is in any way legitimate?
I think my answer would be, I'm going to give you the very conservative New York Times answer, which is you can look at the kinds of allegations we publish and what our standards are, and you can draw your own conclusions, right, about the kind of work we do. I mean, I can tell you that we have to meet such high standards for publication. The Times can't even, we can refer to the Ansari thing as something culturally that happened, but to put an allegation in the New York Times, you need, first of all, corroboration, as much of it as possible. So I've spent a lot of time doing things like, well, saying, who did you tell at the time? Can I call those old friends? I need to check with them, et cetera, et cetera. We also give people a chance to really address the allegations, and we give them time to respond, and that was one of the most dramatic moments in the Weinstein reporting, because we had to go to him and tell him exactly what we had.
But the New York Times is the exception. We have an internet now. We have student papers. We have all sorts of ways in which this stuff can be abused. I mean, I'm as I say, I would like to. I know what the line is for the New York Times, which is great. We just have to be aware that this is subject to abuse elsewhere around the place.
Right, but we haven't seen, I don't think, obviously there's been a lot of Me Too on the internet, but my experience is that it is still really hard for women to come forward I have got plenty of women who I've tried to persuade to come forward with allegations, and so many of them don't want to. And one of the biggest things they'll say is, it wasn't serious enough. They'll say, oh, you know, it's not like I was raped or something. And I'll say, but you had a job on the line. This seems like a pretty clear case of sexual harassment. It's part of a pattern. We have got 10 other women. And they're like, oh, Jodi, it's just better to forget it. I can't do it. So my experience is not of this army of women coming forward and pointing fingers. It's more of still this enormous reluctance to do so.
And they have every right to do that.
Of course. No, and in fact...
But notice that they are making the very distinctions that we're getting at that thing we talked about earlier. Where's the boundary? And that can be so blurry that it's troublesome. I mean, I think if you have a clear standard for what's counted as sexual harassment. So, for example, James Damore at Google was fired because he wrote something on the internet arguing about the diversity practices of Google, taking the side that the policy decision to just hire more women regardless and not hire any men was unfair. That in fact, to get 50-50 in coding from a graduating class in coders that's 80% male, 20% female, is all but impossible. But now he was actually accused of sexual harassment for writing that, because him having those opinions made the workplace a hostile environment for women. So people are actually being told that they are, and so far the National Labor Review Board, which took up the case, backed up Google. So there's a point at which someone who just philosophically disagrees with some of the assumptions of Me Too is himself regarded as a sexual harasser. This is a slippery slope, and it can be abused at any point. If we have a clear line, then I think it makes a great deal of sense. So, for example, if you have a clear line, if you are someone's superior in an office, you can't. If you're a peer, that's fine. I don't want to make offices into this sort of Puritan, terrified atmosphere.
But I'm really curious about something you think, or maybe even something you feel when you say things like that, because I wonder what you care most about and why. Like, having observed this whole situation and seeing essentially that there's this ocean of pain among women for what they've experienced, and that there's a terrible history here that's now coming to light. You seem so much more worried about this getting out of control or innocent people being hurt in the process.
I'm not more concerned at all, but I am concerned. I am more concerned about what we've, and I'm.
That's what I want to ask you.
It's possible to have those two ideas in your head at the same time.
Sure, but is your feeling that because people like me are going to worry about the central concern, which is protecting women against these abuses, you're sort of liberated to worry about the excesses? Or is it that...
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Yeah, or is it that you don't feel the same pressing concern for the women that a lot of other people do? You do.
I really do. I've counseled women who've been subject to this. It's horrifying.
How did you think about...
But it's my job also as a writer to be the asshole of the week and to say, well, what about due process?
What did you think?
Why is it? What ideology is really behind this? And to tease out some of the abuses of it.
What did you think about the Weasel Tier stuff at the New Republic? Because you worked there, and I assume you know him quite well.
We haven't spoken since 1996.
Got it. Okay. Tell us more.
I was. I don't want to say in public about this, but essentially, one man was his superior. One man had the power to discipline, and you can only lobby so much when you don't actually have the power to do it.
Did you know he was doing the stuff to women at TNR?
When one woman came in and talked about it, I was like, we got to get this up. We've got to stop this right now. So I talked to the person who makes the final call, right. And nothing, maybe a small word or something.
I think the person who made the final call, being the owner of the magazine.
Yeah. Who had this weird, productive but kind of strange relationship with this person. And I think that's what happened. He became untouchable. But it was horrifying. And I did everything I could. I mean, I could have quit, I guess, before I did. But I hated it.
And tell me more about what you felt when that all came out a few months ago and what it was
Awful.
like to look back on that time.
Awful. I mean, it's... I experienced it myself. So I mean, if under today's standards, I would definitely be regarded as abused in that context. But my feeling is that you have to try and stop some person doing this, and you go through the normal routes. You can talk to them yourself. You can talk to the boss. You can ask the women to file a suit.
Is there anything you
all
wish...
All of which I did.
Right. Is there anything you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, I wish he'd not done it, but I really don't think that, I think the ultimate responsibility lies with that person. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I could have done. Yeah. When I asked myself, what could I have done?
Right.
I did everything that was in my power, but you're in an environment where you're not the one who calls the shots. Mm-hmm. You're basically number 3 of the magazine. Mm-hmm. And it was Leon who also got me fired, or precipitated my being fired, resigning. So I've experienced the backlash of that kind of emotional abuse.
What happened to the woman?
She's fine. Well, she's not fine. She's still. I had dinner with her a few months ago, and she's still traumatized by the whole thing. But all I can do is help her out and listen to her. Mm-hmm.
I think
in fact, she came up here at one point to escape this, to my place where I could shelter her. So it's something I've seen close up, except you never see it. Actually, you never see it. It's not, that's the trouble. So much of this happens in private spaces, so it becomes incredibly hard. But this was also in the office, but normally after hours parties and things like that the mask slipped. Mm-hmm. I also think at some level this is generational. I mean, I hope it's generational in the sense that I think there were people who grew up, people who grew up in a certain climate. I'm sure. I'm not saying that younger men did do this.
If you think this is generational, I have 2 words for you. Silicon Valley. Because this is what, we would hear this all the time. So I should make it clear. I was part of a much larger team of reporters, and the Times made this extraordinary commitment to sexual harassment reporting, and we fanned out to all of these different industries, right? We were doing Weinstein, and my colleagues did the Bill O'Reilly story, which was a very seminal story, and there were Silicon Valley stories, and there was a really devastating story set at 2 Ford factories in Chicago. And what was really like one of the most extraordinary reporting experiences of my life is that all of these women who had nothing in common had the same stories. And we would say, how could these patterns of behavior, how could their experiences be so similar? How could Gwyneth Paltrow and a Ford worker in Chicago be telling us the exact same things? And one of the things I think we learned is that it's not about the industry, and it's not confined to any particular time and place. And the Silicon Valley stories were very telling because people would try to say to us, oh, Bill O'Reilly, Harvey Weinstein, those guys are dinosaurs. They're from another generation. But then if you look at these venture capitalists who are much younger, and they're part of this utopian world, right? The technology world tried to create the world anew, and yet, you know, this is the tragedy, right? They ended up importing a lot of the worst of the old world into what they were doing. The story.
Human nature is basically eternal, and,
Well, the Silicon
power,
Valley-
the abuse of power is the major theme of politics forever, and will continue to be.
Right. So
and isn't that what this is at some level? It's an abuse of power.
Absolutely, and that's the argument against it being generational.
Yeah, I understand, and testosterone plus power is often equals bad news, but. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
What does the gender editor do at the New York Times?
Her name is Jessica Bennett, and
What's her remit?
sorry.
What's her remit?
Yeah. So she's pretty project oriented, is my understanding, and I don't want to use an asterisk here because she could represent her job much better than I do, but. I'll tell you about a project she did recently that was really fantastic. You may have seen it. It's called Overlooked, and it's a collection of obituaries that the Times never ran. She and somebody on the obits desk discovered that Deanne Arbus never had an obit in the New York Times. Ida Wells never had an obit in the New York Times. There were all of these extraordinary women who, because of the way the world worked back then, and frankly, the way the Times worked back then, they had never been acknowledged in the newspaper. So Jessica went on this massive undertaking to say, oh my God, if we were going to try to do a restoration and a correction and finally tell these stories, what would they be and what would they look like? And she put together and she assigned a whole series of these obits. You may have read some of them. They're extraordinary, and they were so good that I think they're actually being developed into a TV show to tell the story of these neglected lives. So I think that's the kind of thing she does. It's not that she's right. It's not that she's.
It's not that she's monitoring ideological.
No, not at all. She's looking for. She's looking again. Jessica.
Does the gender editor, does she have any interest in men?
Oh yeah, sure. But what I mean is she's. Again, this is just my account as her colleague. Jessica should speak about her own work, but I think her role is to look for openings to make those kinds of contributions that can really make the paper better. But by the way, about it being about power, I just want to say how heartily I agree with you. I don't think it takes anything away from women to say that the Harvey Weinstein story is about the way power in America functions. The fact that he was... Power anywhere, but especially power in the last 20, 30, 40 years in America. And by the way, the really unbelievable thing is that Weinstein led us back to Trump in a whole new way, right? Because Weinstein employed, for example, tabloids like the National Enquirer to manipulate the media in ways very similar now to patterns we see with Donald Trump. Weinstein used settlements. Does everybody here know what a settlement is in the context of, right? So with Trump, some of these were consensual relationships, so the scenario was quite different. But the notion of paying a woman a lot of money and having her sign this legal agreement that said that she couldn't speak about what had transpired between these people. Weinstein's sort of incredible, unique ability to have tentacles in New York and Washington and LA and kind of work the levers of power. The really uncomfortable questions about Weinstein's relationship, both to the Clintons and the Obamas. One of the really stirring things that an actress said to me in the course of our initial investigation is she said, I used to look at the pictures of Harvey with the Clintons and the Obamas, and that's when I felt the most hopeless. I really felt things will never change because if the Clintons and the Obamas are on his side, what?
Except they didn't know. I mean, I don't believe Barack Obama knew that this guy was still doing this stuff.
There's no evidence that the Obamas knew, but there is evidence with the Clintons. That's
the difference between Obama and the Clintons.
So Tina Brown, when Hillary first ran for president in 2008, and Lena Dunham in 2016 did the exact same thing. They went to the Clinton camp, not to Hillary or Bill themselves, but to aides and said, Harvey Weinstein, serious, problems. Dunham actually said it's assault and rape. I don't know how Tina characterized it, but they attempted to warn Hillary and her people and said, you've got to stop doing business with this guy. I know he's a big fundraiser, but this is only going to lead to major problems. And both women, 8 years apart, were ignored. So anyway,
one of the things I want to get to about why this bubbled up when it bubbled up. I think your story obviously was the key breakthrough in which suddenly people felt it was safe to talk about this stuff. And it's still awkward for a lot of people, inherently awkward talking about other people's sex lives. But the obvious grand exception to the rule of this consciousness, which seems in which everybody concedes, that sexual harassment, sexual abuse is wrong. And we have a president that had an absolutely long, detailed history and was caught on tape talking about the way he treats women, grabbing them without asking, bragging that in fact he was so famous that they never put it. That was the whole point. Right. That quote was like,
I can do whatever I want.
I can do whatever I want. And he was elected by a majority of white women. He's the president of the United States. Nothing of this was able to stick to him, even though it has failed everybody else so far. And if what Trump has done emerged, the evidence of it for another public figure right now, you'd be having another story.
Right.
And that person would be gone from public life. But Trump's centrality to our country right now, the key tyrant at the center of this democracy, it is a kind of rebuke to this. It's an open shame.
Which is the rebuke to the other? Is Trump a rebuke to these revelations, or
no? Obviously, he was.
Or was he part of the precipitating event?
I think he was part of the. This is what I'm trying to argue. Right. Is that I think that Trump's presence in the world, and his history, and his impunity, begot an obvious response emotionally for many women who had been victims of this kind of abuse. And so that was sort of, when you have this hideous sexual harasser, the most powerful person in the country, you tend to want to fight back.
I think you're right in so many ways, and we have felt that from certain people, but I have to tell you, in our initial reporting, Trump cut both ways for sources. Some would say exactly what you're saying. They would say, this is what I can do now. This is a time to draw lines in the sand and to stand up for what's right. And Gwyneth Paltrow's, initial quote to me was, this way of treating women stops now. This is a historical opening to say that we're not going to behave that way anymore. There were other women who felt almost not the opposite, but Trump for them was a cause of hopelessness. And they would say, look at Trump, he was elected anyway. Jodi, why should I come forward? Why should I go on the record? There's no accountability. Now, interestingly, they would also talk about Cosby. They would say, Cosby is walking free. And I would say, Cosby's reputation is ruined. Nobody can watch the Cosby Show anymore. There's been a giant historical correction with Cosby, and that's something.
So why this person out on a promontory here, the exception to every rule? Maybe it was because the last person who could bring up sexual harassment as an issue would be Hillary Clinton, that she was the one candidate that couldn't do it.
I think
she's obviously complicit in a lot of sexual abuse.
Well, I mean, I think it's important.
Some have claimed rape. The woman who was raped claims rape and claims that Hillary was absolutely in on it, covering it up.
I think that it was very telling that when the Access Hollywood tape came out with Trump, it wasn't Hillary Clinton who gave the big speech about it, it was Michelle Obama, because Michelle Obama was a pure figure in that regard. I mean, I want to be careful about the Hillary Clinton stuff because there can be a problem with blaming her instead of Bill for the behavior, which I think we don't want to get to. But I think you're right that there was.
But should Bill Clinton retire from public life?
You know, I don't. It's not that I have an answer.
He's accused of rape. He's accused of sexual harassment. He's accused of sexual abuse. The last thing he did was screw an intern, which is, for the President of the United States, to screw an intern is about as big a power imbalance as you could possibly get. So why is he not cast into the outer darkness with all the rest of them? I
wonder about this myself. I don't have any argument with what you're saying. And I especially wonder because I think this week he's got this new book out. He wrote, I think, a mystery or a thriller with James Patterson. And he's giving all of these interviews. And I've said to myself, who is going to ask him about this stuff? And I don't know the answer.
No one. I mean, I hope someone does. But
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious. I'm curious. Raise your hand in this room if you look at Bill Clinton differently after Me Too. So there's part of our answer, right? I mean, his legacy is, the legacy is forever compromised. Correct? I mean, it just,
yeah. Well, it was at the time. It was as well. I mean, you could see it. I'm proud of my record in exposing it and editorializing in favor of the women in these cases to at least have their day in court. So I'm surprised that people have only just cottoned on to the fact that that Bill was such a sexual abuser.
But for a long time there was no accountability.
Standards, right? Is there a statute of limitations? When did any of these people get to come back in public life? Will we ever see Charlie Rose on television again? He was on it all the time.
Well, it's funny because there was talk of a comeback, and then there was another Washington Post piece that had like 30-something more women allegations. So all of a sudden, the comeback talk came to a crashing halt. I think we're waiting to see. There are some choices there, right? Somebody like I worked on the Louis C.K. story.
Oh yeah, that's
somebody like Louis C.K. could try to make a comeback only among his fans, right? He's still got a core fan base that's probably very strong. Or he could try to make a broader comeback. But again, I think we just haven't seen it yet, and I think that I don't think it's.
Louis C.K. is a special case?
In what sense?
In as much as he always portrayed himself as exactly this kind of person. So there was no real hypocrisy involved. And second, as I understand it, I mean, he did something gross, obviously, but he asked permission first. At least he didn't.
Not so much. Yeah.
I think once or twice that's the case. But anyway, here's a more interesting question. Let's say he's abominable morally. One would take that. Isn't being a comedian, being able to do that, to turn that into humor, maybe? Don't you miss Louis C.K.'s humor? Isn't that a loss we have? I think Louis C.K. is one of the most brilliant comics.
I think a couple of things. I think first of all, the more urgent question is what was lost among the women, because one of the patterns we see in these cases are this often happens to women when they're very young and they're starting out in the workplace. And I can't tell you how many women I've spoken to who feel that their careers were cut off or torqued in some weird way because this happened to them. And a lot of them, even in the era of Me Too, they feel this enormous sense of loss. Like, I'm never going to get those years back. I'm never going to get that opportunity back. What could I have been? What could I have become? So I'm just as concerned with, sort of what we've lost among the women. I think second of all, on Louis C.K. though, is I think he'll decide whether he will or won't make his case to the world about having a comeback And on what terms? And is it a sort of defiant case of screw you world, what I did was not that bad and I'm coming back to reclaim my rightful case? Or will it be a kind of penitent case of, I'm
comedy and penance don't usually go well together.
I have no idea, but it's your move, Louis C.K., right? And let's see how he handles it.
Yeah. I just miss his comedy. There's something about the way in which a lot of people went down without any actual due process of any kind. Washington correspondent of the New Yorker, suddenly fired for unspecified reasons. CNN also fires him immediately. CNN then does its own investigation into it, finds there was nothing to it. He's now back on CNN. That has to be a slightly troubling case for you, does it not?
I think because I haven't reported on that case, I've certainly wondered about it because I know Ryan like you, and also the New Yorker was sort of our journalistic competitor on the Weinstein story. So I think I have only questions and not answers on that one.
Well, I don't think anybody knows, ultimately, except him and whoever might have lodged a complaint, or whatever happened. We don't know anything. It's a black box.
I think what you said about missing Louis C.K. made me think of something that a reader said to me a few months ago, which is she just said, and again, her tone was less ideological and more searching. Maybe some of you feel this way too. She said, I spent the equivalent of years of my life watching Charlie Rose. She said, I watched every night before I went to bed. I loved those interviews. I learned a lot about what the world works, the way the world works from that show. And I just don't really know what to do with my memories of watching that show anymore. Where does that reside in my cultural memory? Where does that live for me? And I think a lot of us have the same questions. I can spoil a little something that'll be on the Times soon, which is that I was talking to Gwyneth Paltrow a few days ago about her feelings about having coming forward all of these months later, and I asked her how she looks at the movies she made with Harvey Weinstein. And remember, she's got a Best Actress Oscar that she won for Shakespeare in Love, which was his film, and he was her mentor. I mean, she got that part because of him. And I said, how do you feel about that movie? And she said, for me, I have to feel okay about that movie because if we throw out all of my work that I did at that time, he wins in some sense. And that's why I believe that.
The ability to separate the art from the person is a distinction that all civilized societies have had. It's not as if people in those positions of power aren't abusing it in other contexts, in other ways. Yet we focus on this as the end of people's career. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I wish I could see some element of mercy in here, and there seems to be none whatsoever.
I don't think it's mercy. I think it's context, and I think it's the difference between what feels like cover-up and suppression and living with difficult information. Like, I'll give you an example. If there's a visual artist who we discover, somebody very lauded, somebody who has museum exhibitions all the time, if we discover that he, in fact, was a harasser and abuser of women.
What does Picasso say?
Exactly. Well, the Picasso stuff, I think, has been known for a long time. The Chuck Close allegations, let's just keep this person purely theoretical so that we don't get too far into the details of any particular case. Let's say it's somebody. Let's say the allegations have just come out and this is new information. And say you're a museum that's been planning a retrospective of this person's work. Do you cancel the exhibit entirely? That's one choice. Or do you do the exhibit, but you include some of this information for context? You have it on the wall plaques so that at least what you're doing is not participating in a whitewashing or a suppression of information.
Do I want to see every painting of Picasso having a little 3 sentences after about his relationship to women. Is that relevant to understanding the painting?
I don't.
Or appreciating it?
I don't.
See, this is part of why I call it a religion in some ways, because people, they have to be completely purged.
But don't you think that people will still stage and go to Picasso exhibitions?
Yeah.
Don't you think the Picasso Museum in Paris right now has got perfectly healthy attendance?
I think it would be ridiculous if up to every plaque they had to have a paragraph
But nobody
about.
is doing that.
I hope not.
I don't think that's happening.
Good.
I don't think that's happening. I think
Liberalism is, to some extent, I mean classical liberalism, the basis of our society, is based on a critical idea. One of the ideas is based on this distinction between public and private. What worries me is that this seeps into the private world. It's rendering relationships really hard. It's rendering the dating scene almost impossible. It's handing people an extremely blunt weapon now that they can utilize against anyone they want. And because the consequences are so devastating for people, because you're fired, Ryan, before, you're reinstated because you did nothing wrong. That doesn't mean that Ryan Lisner is going to have that hung around him the rest of his life. I just think that people are responsible for all sorts of sins and all sorts of misbehavior on a whole variety of levels. Power can be abused on any number of different axes. The question is why this particular one mandates ostracism. And that's what we're doing as a society. We are ostracizing people. They haven't been charged, so they haven't been found innocent or guilty, but they're ostracized. And there's some part of me, even though I believe in exposing this stuff and doing everything you can to stop it, there is still one part of me that thinks I don't want private relationships or sex to be completely frozen by this fear that everything you do as a man is potentially abuse. Well, that's the feeling. I mean, certainly because the line is completely blurry, deliberately, I would think. They are. I mean, I have friends who are terrified about this. Straight guys who are terrified by this and have been terrified by this, racking their brains to think of anything that might have happened in the past. I think that I hope that doesn't happen.
The opposite fear, and then I think we should open it to the audience. The hope, if that's the fear, the hope is that it makes sex better. The hope is that it makes sex better because the stories I have heard from so many women who felt either outright victimized or like they were on unsteady ground or like they didn't have enough power in the relationship to exert themselves, or like their worry and their anxiety was so great that it took over the situation. I think women want to feel more confident and safer and more at ease in these interactions, which could hopefully lead to more joy.
One last note before we go to Q&A, which is, I talked to many women in my life about this at the time, because you want to know, did it happen to you? What has happened? My sister was the most, well, my mother was like, of course not. My sister was, oh yeah, those pathetic creeps. They're always hitting on me. I told them to knock it off. I just ignore them. They pester me. And Emma Thompson also had that response. We used to say, oh, is he pestering you? And there's something about that seems to me to be empowering about a woman's response, because it isn't giving him the power. It's treating him as a pest. And one of the problems I worry about, if this meme takes over entirely, is that women will see themselves and construct themselves entirely as potential victims or victims. And I think that kind of, in a strange kind of way, disempowers women. And with any luck, what you've done and what others have done will empower more women to say, fuck off, or that's enough, or... And there's something in the crispness of that attitude, which is that we are above you. I mean, there is something in their attempt to have sex that renders all men pathetic. And some of this is kind of pathos in a way, psychologically. I mean, look at Weinstein. He's a foul, disgusting blob. And yet he was banging the hottest girls. And using his power to do that, at some level, you know you're a hopeless, unattractive, nasty person. But you still have to get laid. And that's true of so many people in these places. I mean, men committing adultery, which used to be the real sin, are everywhere. Anyway, that's just a thought. I think sometimes these things are complicated.